Ever wonder how a top website is made? Well, on today's video, we're going to talk about this mouse trail effect as seen on the Midnight website. So what we've got here is a trail that when we move our mouse around the page, we get this effect and it looks really, really good. So we're going to make this in our own way. Here's our version, which looks something like this. So in today's video, we'll be talking about how we make this effect from scratch, but we will be needing some help from a slinky. So first of all, let's look at the site that we've built already. So what we have is a basic site that looks like this. There is no mouse trail currently on this. So how do we go about building this in? So firstly, let's have a look at the HTML. It's fairly simple HTML. So we've got a header with some text, we've got a section with some figures, and that's kind of it. Basically, we're using a grid layout to basically you can make it look like this. In the style sheet, again, it looks fairly simple in the same way. We have our kind of usual reset. We've got a font style. We've got some font sizing in here. And then we've just got this grid set up, which is a 4-column grid. And then we've got things spanning different grids as well. So every single, what we've got here is our figures span 2 columns. So we get something that looks like this. But what we want to do is have some kind of mouse trail. So we're going to do this in a few different parts. Firstly, we need something to draw the mouse trail, which we don't currently have on the site. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding this in with an SVG, a scalable vector graphic. So what we're going to do first of all is just add this to the site without any of this mouse movement, just to see how this works. So at the bottom of our HTML, we're going to do this after the section tag. I'm just going to add in an SVG tag. Now what we can do is make our own images from scratch. We could use Figma or some kind of drawing program like Illustrator to actually make an SVG, or we could just write it ourselves. Here I'm going to write an SVG and I'm going to give this a path in here as well. Now what a path does is it draws a line, and what we can do is describe what that line looks like by adding something that looks like this. D equals in quotes. Now, there's a lot of SVG code that we can add in here. There's things that do curves, there's things that do lines. We're just going to basically say, where does this start, and draw a line to somewhere. So we're going to start somewhere by writing the word, the letter M, then a space. And let's just start this at 100, space, 100. And this is kind of where we're putting the pen down. And then we're going to draw a line to 200, space, 200. So what we should have is a line that goes 100 by 100 in a kind of diagonal. So does this work? Let's save and let's see. So back here, when we refresh, if we scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's basically something down here. There's now a new gap, but we haven't really kind of give it any style. We don't know what color the line should be. So next we're going to fill this in. We're going to give it some style. So back in my style sheet, what I'm going to do is go right to the bottom, and what I want to do is, in case I might have other SVGs, is I'm just going to quickly give this SGV a class. Class equal trail. So let's just give that some style. So svg.trail, and let's just put this over everything. So position fixed, and we're going to fix it in the top left corner at 0 and 0. So what we should see is this disappears from the bottom of the page now. There's none down here, but technically there is something up here. It's just over everything right now. But again, there's no style on that path. So let's just give this something like a z-index of 1000, just so it's always over everything. And let's next give it svg.trail space path. Let's basically give this some look. So here what I can do is give it a stroke color. Stroke is going to be, let's say, white. So what you might have noticed earlier in the code is I do actually have a CSS variable up here called dash dash color dash trail. So instead of this just being white, I'm going to basically make this a variable dash dash color trail, basically the same thing. So let's go and see what that does. So now what I get is this line being here at all times. I can give that line a bit of thickness. I can give it some rounded edges, for instance. So that's what we're going to do next. First thing we're going to do is give it a stroke width of 8 pixels, let's say. Just looks good. And we're going to give this a line cap of round. And eventually what I also need is a line join of round as well. So basically a line cap is the end, and line join is if there's any kind of points within this as well. But let's see how this looks. Again, this has made it a bit thicker, but notice this is kind of going off here. Now, the reason this is going off is it doesn't really know where to draw. So it doesn't know what size the canvas is, it doesn't know how big the SVG is. But what I want to do is actually back in the index.html, we want to give this SVG some kind of size in. We want to say, where should this be drawing within? Like, what is the size of our artboard? So we're going to add in, after class trail, we're going to do a view box, and we're going to make it equal to the size of this thing we're drawing in. So let's, for now, just make it 0 space 0 space 400 by 400, 400 across, 400 down. And if we save it now and we look, we'll see this being pretty big. Now, the reason why it's pretty big is we haven't give this SVG a size. We said it's 400 and it's drawing correctly, but it's just basically filling the whole screen right now. And that's because in my style sheet, I haven't give this SVG trail a width and height. So I'm just going to give this a width of 400 pixels and a height of 400 pixels as well. So what we should see is we've made our own image that goes over this entire page. Nothing too exciting right now, but we've made something that kind of looks like a line. So let's just add one more thing to this. Let's add another part into this line. So back in my index.html, I'm also going to give this another line. We're drawing from 100 to 100, then 200, 200. Let's make another line to, let's say, 300 space 100, let's say. And let's save it and let's see what this looks like. This has drawn a shape and it's filling in the color as well as the edge. So let's get rid of this fill shape. So back in style, what I'm also going to say is there's not just a stroke, but there's also a fill in SVG. Let's make fill be none. So now what we get is something that looks like this. We've just made our very own SVG. So what we want to do is actually draw this where the mouse moves, but not just be in the corner. So there's a few things we need to set up. Now, what we need to set up is some JavaScript, because when we move the mouse, this is a user interaction, and we need some script to be this. This isn't just a static with V shape. So let's do this next. So back in our code, what we're going to do is add a new script and new file called trail.js, let's call it trail.js. Now, if I want to use this in my index.html, I just need to connect the two. So back in my index.html, below where I've got this SVG, I'm also going to add in a script tag. Now, the script tag needs a source, src, and this is going to be equal to what we just call that file, trail.js. Now, what we need to do is just save this. So what are we trying to get here? Well, basically what we want to do is, well, I want this path with d equals m and all this like jargon to basically be equal to some points on the page. Now, what I want to do is, I don't want to start by doing this slinky kind of effect. What I'm going to do is just draw some stuff on the screen and then basically fix it later on. So what do we want to do here? Well, when we move the mouse, what I want to do is just add some extra points in here and say, wherever the mouse is right now, draw an extra line to that path. So what we're going to do in my trail is basically hold a list of points. Now, how do we go about doing this? So the first thing I want to do is just set up what the SVG is. So I'm going to do a constant with an SVG, and this is going to be equal to something in my document with the dot query selector, which means select the thing. And then what we want to do is select what we want. So in quotes, we're going to do the SVG with the class of trail. Now, within this, we also want to update the path itself. So we'll get the path from this SVG. So we'll do a constant and we'll call it path. Again, we're making up these names, and we'll make this equal to, in the SVG, we'll do a dot query selector. And in round brackets, what do we want to select in the SVG? Well, the path. We could have done here document and then svg.trail space path. Again, I like to do it this way in case I update this class name. It just has a knock-on effect everywhere. Now, what I also want to do is basically hold all the points where I'm moving. So what I want to do is, at the moment, I've got 100, 100, 200, 200, 300, 100, basically 3 points. So instead, what we're going to do is have this in JavaScript instead. So I'm going to do a constant points. And at the beginning, what we want it to be is just an empty list. So nothing in there until we move the mouse. Now, what we're going to do is basically do a function that listens for when the mouse moves. So we're going to make a new function in here. Const is move. And this is going to be equal to a function, some round brackets, an arrow, and curly brackets. Now, function is basically just saying, do this thing when something happens. For the moment, move never does anything because we've just set it up, we're never running it. So what we're going to do below this is run this when we move the mouse. So on the whole page, on the document, we're going to dot add an event listener. Again, watch out for the capitals here, capital E, capital L. What do we want to listen out for? Well, there's some event happening, and this is built into JavaScript. We're going to listen out in quotes for the mouse move event. What do we want to do when we do the mouse move? Well, comma, we'll do the move function. So whenever we move the mouse, this function will run. So let's save. And what we want to do in here is open up these curly brackets because we want a bit of room. Now, one nice thing that JavaScript gives us is if we are doing this event listener, it also can pass in the event itself to basically say, where is the mouse right now? Because at the moment, there's nothing that says where is the mouse. So I can add this in by adding the word event. Event isn't a special word. If this was called E or EV, it still would work in the same way as long as we match up our code. Now, what I want to do here is basically find where the X and Y position are. So I'm going to save this. In the function, I'm going to do a constant X, and this is going to be equal to the client dot client X. Now, what is the difference between client X and page X? This is if we scroll down the page, this is based on the corner rather than the whole page. So we'll do Y as well, event client Y. What do we want to do with X and Y? Well, what we want to do is save it to this points list. So on the points list, we're going to push a new point to this. Now, we'll do some round brackets, but what we want to do is store X and Y as basically an object. Where is the coordinates on this? So we're going to do some curly brackets here and open them up. Then what we want to do is say, let's make up some like coordinates here. X is equal to X and Y is Y. So this looks like kind of just a list. So what we'll start to get as we move around the page is our point list fills up, but we're not actually drawing anything yet. We're just saving it in JavaScript to potentially do something eventually. So how do we go about making this actually do something? Well, what we want to do is, if we look at our index.html, is we want this M to basically add all the coordinates in here. So what we're going to do is actually add in another function. Now, the reason we'll do this will become clear a little bit later. So let's add a constant called anim. Anim just means animate. And what we're going to do is do a function. Function is round brackets, arrow, and then curly brackets. Now, in here, what we want to do is say, when we are running on every single frame of the page, we want to draw this points list. So where the points are right now, basically fill this in on the path itself. So what I want to do is say, if there's 50 points, make this be 50 points. So to do this, we're going to run this. How are we going to run this? Well, I need a bit of code to do this. So the code I'm going to do looks a little bit weird, but let's go with it for now. What we want to do is something like this. Path.set attributes. And what do we want to set? Well, we want to set D. And the reason we want to set D is because we want to update this thing here. What we're going to do in here is do comma and then backtick. Backtick because we want to put stuff in here. Now, what do we want to put in here generally? Something that looks like M and then 100, 100, L, 200, 200, another line, 300, 300, another line, 123, let's say. But basically what we want is this M to be at the start and then these coordinates to be passed in from the points. So we're just going to keep M and then space for now. But what we want to do is go over each point and then basically make a new point in here and then join them all together with an L in the middle. So we're going to do a dollar sign and curly brackets. And then we're going to take all the points and then do dot map. What map does is it takes the list and it basically converts it into a new thing. Now, what do we want to convert it into is up to us. So here we're going to do this in round brackets. P for a point goes to what? Well, what I wanted to go to is kind of similar to what we have in here, a number space number. So here what I'm going to do is another backtick and say with our dollar curly brackets, p.x space $, curly brackets, p.y. So basically what we're doing here is we're filling in this number in here and then this number in here. But this is going to give us basically a list. It's still going to be a list of now strings of coordinates. So what we're going to do after this dot map is then join them all together into a new string, one big long string, dot join, and then round brackets. How do you want to join them together? Well, let's go and look at here. Well, this thing is joined together with a space L space. This thing here is joined together with a space L space. So we're going to do that. Here we're going to do L space L space. Now this was a lot, but let's see if this works. It won't at the moment, so there is a reason why. We'll talk about it in a sec. So if I go back and I move my mouse, nothing happens, which kind of makes sense. This anim function never runs. So we've written the code, but just we've never used it. So how do we make it work? Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this when we start the page, anim. So this will run once when we load the page. So if I save it now and go back and refresh, it disappears because this has got no points at the moment. So it's not drawn any line. But what we want to do is keep animating this over and over again. So to do this, we're going to add a space underneath, still within the anim function, and do request animation frame. Basically, what happens next time is we want to run another function. What do we run next time is also anim. So we're setting the function off, and then we're updating the line, and then we're saying next time you need to do something, run it again, and run it again, and run it again, and run it again. So let's save it now, and let's see what happens. So we'll go back, and then if we go to the top corner, we'll see this draw in. Now what you might notice is this only draws up to 400 by 400. So there's a bit of an issue here. So what we're going to do in a sec is basically fix this SVG. So at the moment, the reason why this SVG is only 400 by 400 is that's what we set it in the style as. So we set here 400 by 400. So let's just get rid of this for now and let's save it again. What happens here is this goes really, really big. And the reason it goes really, really big is it's trying to stretch across the page. And why is it suddenly so large is because we have a view box on the index.html as well. So this is currently here. It's saying, well, this was an artboard of 400, so I'll just make it bigger, which kind of makes sense. So what we want to do is just resize this up. And we want to resize it whenever we resize the browser itself. So basically what we want to put in here and in here is how big is the window? How big is basically the size of the browser right now? And then basically make it the right size. So back in our trail.js, what I'm going to add is another function in here. I'm going to add another function called resize. And this is going to be equal to a function, round brackets, arrow, curly brackets. And what we want to do is I want to basically size this SVG, which I made at the top, and give it a width and a height, but also a view box as well. So here what I'm going to do is just save a constant called WW. WW, I'm just calling window width, and here I'm going to make it equal to the window, which is the browser. Document is basically the page that's within a window. So the window is kind of what we can see, and a document is within the size of it. So here we're going to do window.innerWidth, and underneath we'll do a WH, window height, and this is the window's inner height. Now what we want to do is use them to size up both the SVG in the style sheet, but also the view box attribute as well. So here on the SVG, we're going to do dot style dot width. And this is going to be equal to the window width, and we need to give it a unit, so pixels. So we'll do this with the height as well. So style dot height. This is going to be the window width, window height plus pixels. And we also want to give this view box thing. So what we just removed here, view box, let's set an attribute on that. So SVG set attribute, because this is in HTML, we're going to do the view box. And this is going to be equal in a backtick to 0, space 0. And then we'll do this $, curly brackets, the window width, and then another $, and curly brackets, window height. So basically we're sizing the SVG just to fill a screen essentially. But this resize function never runs. So what do we need to do? run it. So we're going to do a resize when we start the whole thing, just to set this up. But we'll also do this above here. We'll do it here. We'll do this whenever the window changes size as well. So the window, let's add an event listener to it. What do we want to listen out for? Well, anytime it's resized. And what do we want to do when we resize? Well, run this resize function, resize. So now what we'll get is this looking a little bit better. So if we go back and refresh, we can see that this draws across the entire page. So even if I make this a little bit smaller, this still looks pretty good because it's window fixed. This scrolls as well. We could just keep it as this if you wanted to, but it doesn't look great. It looks a little bit messy, but we have some kind of trail. So what we're going to do next is basically fix this a little bit more. So the initial way you might think about how to solve this and how we kind of would do this on the Midnight site like this is basically just limit how long this points list can get. Now, that was the way that I initially thought that it worked, but I was wrong. But let's show you kind of what I meant. So what we could have done is basically say, well, what we have in move is basically we're adding points, but we're never getting rid of points or limiting to a certain number. So what I could say after move is something like this. Let's take the points list, but let's overwrite it. So what we want to do is say points is equal to points, but what we want to do is just slice off some points. So we'll take the points and then let's take the last 20, let's say. So points dot length minus 20. Is that right? No, it might not be wrong. Let's try it anyway. But what we want to do, and we'll get an error here, is because we're updating points, and points was a constant. So let's just change this to let instead. So let's see if this works. So what we'll get is something that looks kind of like this. Now, this isn't exactly right. As you can kind of tell, it kind of stops. It never gets any shorter. So the faster I move this, the more that will just stay in place. So we could just leave it like that, and it could be like, cool, that works. That's pretty good. But what we want to do is think about how this actually works as something like a slinky. So what we're going to talk about next is how we can fix this. So what I'm kind of doing with the slinky is kind of similar to what we would do with this mouse movement. So essentially what I want to do is almost like hold a bunch of points that kind of move towards this end point kind of slowly, which is kind of what's happening. So if I pull this one over here and kind of go off the screen, then notice the tension between all these different points. There's more tension on this side because naturally this is pulling over here and it naturally gets closer and closer together as we get further away from this point. And of course, what would happen is over time, this would slowly go towards this end point, which is kind of what happens on here as well. So what we're going to think about is taking this first point and essentially just moving it towards where the mouse currently is, and then taking the rest of the points and just slowly transitioning them together. So the first point is connected to the second point. The second point is connected to the third point is connected to the fourth point, and so on. So this is kind of how the effect actually works. It isn't what we've kind of got, which is just 20 points. Actually, it's something a little bit different. So what we're going to do is transition our current code into something that looks a little bit better. So the first thing I need to do is just hold a mouse position and keep it updated at all points. So when I'm doing this animation, there's always a kind of point I'm aiming towards over time. So let's do this in our code. So how do we do this? So the first thing I want to do is basically right at the top of our trail.js, I'm just going to hold the mouse position itself. So I'm going to make a new one called let mouse. And this is going to be equal to what? Well, I'm just going to make this x equal to 0 and just y equal to 0 just to begin with, just to basically keep this in mind. What I want to do is when I move the mouse, I want to update this mouse position itself. So what we're going to do in the mouse move function is not make this 0 and 1, but essentially just say the mouse x position is where x is, and the y position is where y is. So here what we're going to say is mouse.x is equal to x, which is event.clientX. And we'll do mouse.y is equal to y. Basically, we could just shorten this by putting this in here. So should we do that? I will leave it as is for now. Now, what we want to do is basically say, well, when we move the mouse, if there's no points in here, we want to set up our slinky. We want to set it in place in here. So we also want to give them how many points are there in my slinky? Well, in my slinky, there's around about, I think, 50. So let's say 50 in here as well. So we'll add a new variable in here called segments. Let segments be equal to 50. Now, what I want to do is as soon as I move the mouse, I want to set my slinky in place. Now, I don't want to draw any points, but what I want to do is when I move the mouse, I want to move those slinky points towards the mouse. Now, the difference here is at the moment, what we're doing is we're setting the points wherever we draw them, and they freeze. As you can see here, as soon as we move the mouse, they freeze. But what we want to do is actually the opposite. We want to set the slinky and then move all these points towards where they should go. So this is slightly different. So what we don't need is actually this line here on line 23. We don't need this points slice. We also don't actually need this points.push. What we want to do is set this up to be, as soon as we move the mouse, we want to set up our number of segments. So around this code, what we're going to do is say, if there isn't any points in my list, add 50 points. So if round brackets points.length is equal to 0. If it's empty, what I want to do is add 50 points. I want to set up my slinky on the page. Remember, if I don't move the mouse, say I'm on an iPhone and there's a hover state, then don't do anything. Don't draw any line. But if there is any movement, set up the slinky. So for round brackets, curly brackets, what do we want to do in the for loop? We're going to say let I equal 0, and then semicolon, I less than segments, because we're going to do a loop of 50 segments, and then semicolon, I plus plus, add 1 to I. What do we want to do in here? Well, every single time I want to add this point. So I'm going to do points, this push below, and just copy and paste this in here. So what we're doing in here is saying, if there is no slinky, set up a slinky. All the segments should be in the same place when we start. So let's see this in action. We're going to save and let's go back. So as soon as I refresh, notice this is in place. So this stays here where I've just moved. If I am refreshing, I'm not moving until I move, then it all stays in place. So what we've done is set up the slinky almost like a top-down view, almost like looking down the slinky. But then what we want to do is shift this over and move it towards where the mouse now is moved to. So how do we do this? Now, what we know in our code is the mouse has moved. If this runs twice and moving around, then the slinky is set up, but the slinky is not moving. So what I want to do in my animate is basically start moving all the points in the slinky towards where the mouse should actually be. So what we're going to do in anim is actually a little bit of extra code. Now, what does this look like? Now, what we want to do is basically similar to a slinky. Like, I want my mouse point to be where I'm holding the slinky at the moment, and then I want to move all of the points towards the slinky's end point. So what I want to do to begin with is let's find out where we should start. So let's find out where we should start. Let's give this some variables. Let's say starting point. And let's say this is something like let px for the first point be equal to where the mouse is currently, mouse.x, and then let's let py be equal to mouse.y. Now what we want to do on every single frame of the page is slowly start to move towards where the mouse is. So if I'm over here, notice that all my slinkies kind of move towards where everything is, right? So what we want to do is go over every single point and say, go towards this, please. So to do this, we're going to do a loop. We're going to do points dot for each, and in round brackets, we're going to say, we'll give each point a name. Let's call it P, and let's make it go to an arrow function. So something that looks like that. Now, what I also want to do in here is I want to pass in, let's put this in brackets actually. Let's put this in brackets. That'll look nice. We can also pass in what number this is, because remember that we have a number of links in here, 50. We always want to find what the next one is doing. So each one is connected to each other. We'll talk about this in a second. So we'll do comma and then index after this P. So this is a loop. What we're doing, we're finding 50 segments. And for each segment, we want to move each one closer to the next point. So in here, what we're going to say is Well, the point should be moving towards the next point. To begin with, what we want is point x to be equal to essentially where the starting point is, px, and we'll do point y is equal to py. Basically, this is just saying like mouse x and mouse y in here. Let's just save that and see what it looks like. So let's save, and what we'll get now is if we refresh, basically this is broken, I think. Ah, yes, I call this p, and I call this one point. So let's call this p.x and p.y. So my mistake, let's fix that. But what we'll get now is all of these slinky points are moving exactly to where this mouse position is. So we get this kind of ball that's following us around, which isn't exactly what we want. What we want to do is basically say, well, the first point is correct. The first point should be where the mouse is. But what we want to do is find the next point. So here what we can say is, let's find the next point. Let's make something called n for next, and make this be equal to, in our points, in all of the points, we want to get our index. This would be the current point, but let's get the next one. Let's add one to it. If there isn't an endpoint, for instance, the very last chain doesn't have an end, so there isn't a next point, we'll say if there is an end, then what we want to do is say, well, this starting point should be a little bit further away. So here what we're going to say is px should be equal to px, the mouse point, but let's take away a little bit. Let's kind of almost like transition it towards it. Let's take away a little bit the point, current point, minus the next point, but let's times that all by a small factor, so something like 0.5. Next, what we want to do is the same thing for py. So when we run this on the next time, it'll be a little bit further away. p.y minus n.y, and let's times 0.5. So what we're saying here is start, but then pull this along, pull the next one along for the next loop, essentially. So now if we save it, what we'll get is something that looks like this. So what we've got is a slinky effect here. Essentially what we're doing is we're pulling the slinky towards us, and then as we stop, basically the slinky gets closer and closer and closer. Now, what we can do is change these numbers. So let's say this is 0.1 and 0.1 in here. What we'll get is something that's a little bit tighter. So basically this is almost like how tight the slinky is. The smaller the number, the tighter and the quicker it'll go. If I make this 0.9, for instance, this will just be a lot longer. And you can actually see how like edgy it gets sometimes as well. Now, if you don't like these edges and you want something that's very, very long, what you can do is just increase the number of segments. So I could do something like 100 segments in here, and notice this is a little bit still too edgy, but what I would do is then reduce this down as well so it gets a longer trail. So let's see how that looks. Nice, nice, nice. And what we can do is just play around with this and kind of really notice how this kind of works. And it's up to you how you want this to work. Now, one thing you might notice is if I refresh the page, there's this kind of big V thing that kind of pops up. So what I'm just going to do is get rid of this like big V that pops up. In my index.html, there's this path. I'm just going to get rid of the D attribute in here. And I'm also going to make the view box just something like 1 and 1, because it's not 400 by 400 anymore, and this V should just disappear. But what we'll do is as soon as we start to move on the page, the slinky kind of comes into play and it follows itself around. So what we've done in our code is essentially set up a slinky rather than actually draw where the points actually go. And then we're transitioning each point or each chain within the slinky towards the next point. We're saying, get the point to start with, and then move slightly closer to the next one, move slightly closer to the next one, slightly closer to the next one for as many segments as there is. And what we'll get is basically the same effect as what we see on the Midnight site. And what we've done is we've built this mouse trail that looks really great very, very quickly. So I hope you really enjoyed this Slinky tutorial. If you did, please give it a like. And if there's anything you'd like me to cover as well, just please put it in the comments below. Like and subscribe, do all the usual things, tell your friends about it, and I'll see you in a video very soon.